Hey class, I want to try to make a short video today to wrap up some points about the Euthyphro. And so in the last video I made about the Euthyphro, I spent a lot of time talking about the theory of the forms, which comes up when Socrates is asking Euthyphro for a definition of piety, right, which was not a definition of the word piety, but a definition of piety itself. And I made an analogy with a definition of a triangle, not the definition of the word triangle, but the sort of definition of a triangle that one would learn in a geometry class, and that led us to a discussion of Plato's theory of the forms, which is eternal universal truths that are sort of like archetypes of all the things that exist in the world, all the material, visible things that exist in the world. The forms are sort of like the archetypical versions of. And one of the things that I don't think I was particularly clear about is why these things are not something that one can sense, right? But if you think about the form of the triangle, sort of the form of the triangle doesn't have a color, right? There's nothing in the definition of a triangle that indicates what color it is, but anything that you see in the world around you will have a color. There's also nothing in the form of the triangle that indicates its size. It just says the number of angles it'll have, but it doesn't say anything about the length of the side. So something could be very, very small and be a triangle, or it could be very, very big and be a triangle, right? So ultimately for Plato, the true reality that is important for us to understand is not the physical, material, sensible world that we see around us, but a sort of a world of the forms that we only have access to through reasoning, in the way we only have access to sort of geometrical truths by reasoning and not by, sensing, which is why when you're studying geometry in school, right, at a certain point you stop drawing the shapes and you just focus on learning the formulas and things like that. Well, as the Euthyphro goes on, one gets the sense, and I alluded to this in the previous video, right, that the forms are sort of better than the gods, because the gods are not eternally universal, but the forms are. And so part of what Socrates seems to be suggesting is that if we could, through the activity of philosophy, come to have knowledge of the forms, we would not need to rely on the traditional stories and myths of, let's say, ancient Greece for knowledge about what's right and wrong, right? Euthyphro is relying on the stories to tell him what's right or wrong, to tell him whether he should prosecute his father or not. And part of what Socrates is suggesting is that it's not necessary for us to rely on those stories. We only have to rely on those stories because we don't have knowledge of the form of justice. If we had knowledge of those forms, then we wouldn't have to rely on the gods. So part of what is happening when Socrates is debating with Euthyphro is that we're becoming aware of Euthyphro's lack of knowledge of the forms, and we are seeing how this lack of knowledge creates a situation where Euthyphro doesn't know what he's talking about, but due to his reliance on traditional stories and beliefs, thinks that he does. Right? So Euthyphro has a kind of invincible ignorance where he doesn't know that he doesn't know. So on the one hand, the theory of the forms have a certain social, cultural critique embedded in them, insofar as if we rely on the theory of the forms, then we no longer have to rely on the traditions of Athens. And so we can begin to see hints in the Euthyphro of how Socrates' theory of the forms puts him at odds with his fellow citizens and the city and ultimately the gods. And that's something that we'll see continue to play out in the Apology.